going forward in the United Nations? Whichever you prefer.
Yes, Mr. Gerard, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I think it's a very good and interesting initiative from your university and the Marshall Islands. And I think it's the right moment and the right time to do that. And it goes very well also with the plans we have, the German mission. We are now members of the Security Council for 2 years. And we will have the so-called monthly presidency in the Security Council. And during our campaign, because we had to campaign for this 2 years of non-permanent membership at the UN Security Council, we saw in the discussions that there is a huge interest really in taking up the issue of climate change and its security implications. And we had an event together with our Portuguese colleagues last Friday with more than 100 attendants, maybe a mixture like here, academics, diplomatic missions and others, where we discussed and we focused really on the security implications of climate change. And you are all well aware about the negative effects sea level rise will have over the next years and decades. Not only sea level rise, but other effects induced by climate change, like migration, food security, water. So there are a lot of topics that have very important security implications. And therefore, we have decided to take up this issue in the Security Council. And for those who are not familiar with the United Nations and the work of the Council, who might think, okay, that the Council normally deals with very concrete issues, like, let's say, the situation in Libya or what's going on in Sudan. But this is one part of the work of the Security Council. Another very important part is also to look a little bit ahead of the current crisis, of the current peacekeeping missions. And, for example, only this year, our Brazilian colleagues have had a very interesting discussion on the connection between development and security. And, for example, next month, the presidency of Gabon will focus on the relationship between security and HIV/AIDS. So the initiative we are presenting to the Council, it's not completely new, because the United Kingdom was the first country in 2007 to hold an open debate on this issue. But we think that over the last 4 years, really a lot has changed. And the discussion, not only at the UN, is really more intense, and an event like the one you're organizing here shows that. And so we really want to take up the issue and want to hold on the 20th of July an open debate where we would like to see as much participation as possible from the member states. We are counting, obviously, on the small island development states, but also on others, all those who might feel affected by the security implications of climate change. And in the UN context, maybe it's also necessary to explain that there are obviously some reservations about doing that. And I want to be very open and frank here, because you see the real climate negotiations are going on in the framework of the UNFCCC, with Cancun, Durban, the upcoming meeting. And the countries there are some countries, some member states who are concerned that by dealing with these kind of issues in the Security Council, we might get into the business of the mandates of other UN organs. And this is definitely not the case. And that's why we have to be very precise and very clear that when we take up this issue, we have to deal exclusively with the security implications. It's only the security implications, the long-term security implications, and to see what can be done from the side of the Council. I don't want to raise expectations, and as I said, it's after 4 years a first step that we are taking, but we would like to see a concrete outcome of this debate, where we can say, okay, the Council has debated for a whole day on this issue, and we want to look a little bit forward. That can be, I imagine you all have seen the report the Secretary General has made in 2009. It was the first time that the Secretary General has made a report that highlighted some of the security implications. So we want to take this up and see if we can really have a kind of outcome that establishes this kind of discussions in the Security Council for the next years to come, because we think this issue will not go away. On the contrary, I think we will need more and more detailed discussions on it. And I know from our Portuguese friends that they have the presidency in November, that they are thinking about doing something similar. So maybe as a introduction from my side on the way forward, not here on your legal discussion, and obviously we are very much interested in the outcome of your conference here, and we will study very closely the legal consequences and your recommendations that you will come up with. But on the political side, this is the way forward we want to take, bringing it to the Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks for sharing that with us. So I think everyone here, or at least everyone who has spoken, is in agreement that the most important thing going forward is mitigation measures, is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are the underlying cause of much of the climate change that is happening. But we also are confronted with the reality that, and we heard a lot about this yesterday from the oceanographer, Dr. Carr, that regardless of the degree of mitigation that we engage in, even if greenhouse gas emissions would be eliminated going forward immediately, which obviously won't happen, the world is facing significant sea level rise. So in addition to very significant mitigation measures, we need adaptation. We need measures to cope with the inevitability of sea level rise. What is not inevitable is the exact pace of it or degree of it. But to cope with the sea level rise that is absolutely coming as a physical reality, the kinds of measures that we've discussed fall into 4 general categories. The first of those categories is the question, or 4 questions. One is, do we need new international agreements, whether multinational or bilateral or some other kind of international agreement? The second set of issues that we've been talking about are the issues of statehood and statelessness, and of maritime boundaries and EEZ and fishing rights and so forth. The third set of issues concern the financing of adaptation issues, and the fourth set of issues that we focused on concern legal liability. So in the panel that we just had, we were of course talking about the question of whether there should be a new international agreement on climate change, and there was a very good exchange of views, and we ended with the question, what is the view of the sending countries, the countries that would be the sources of the people doing the, who would be doing the immigration, and what is the view of the receiving countries, the countries that are most likely to be called upon to take in international people who are climate displaced. So what I'd like to do now is to just invite people from either the source countries or receiving countries to give some views on whether you personally and how you think your countries would feel about this kind of an international agreement. Ambassador?
Thank you, Professor Gerard. Let me start off by trying to summarize some of the discussions that have taken place since yesterday and today, as we see it from the political side. But I should also say on behalf of the Minister and our President that we thought this was, the last 2 days have been quite outstanding 2 days. We had full days of intellectual debate and discussion, very creative ideas that were shared among the academics and political leaders. And it shows a real atmosphere of solidarity and common concern. And we're very pleased also with the diversity and interdisciplinary nature of the participation and discussion. I'm so pleased that there was so much response to the call for papers from Columbia University and from our government. This is very exciting. But just listening to some of the discussions that went on from yesterday and today, I think first there is a recognition that for the short term, at least before we reach certain scientific and perceptual underground thresholds, we need to do our utmost to address the cause of the problem, urgently and dramatically cut emissions. I think that was one of the main issues that came up, and I think the professor had just said that just before me, that the need to cut emissions is really one of the priorities that this group has been articulating. We also recognize also that the UNFCCC is not working, and that more proactive and adversarial approaches might need to be adopted. It is not good enough for major emitters to point to the lack of action elsewhere as the reason for their own caution or lack of ambition. I think these emissions are now threatening to wipe off some countries off the map, and then that cannot be the way forward for humanity and for the planet. I sense that the most vulnerable states or countries need to think hard now about how to work together to use the law to make emitters responsible for their actions. Numerous opportunities exist today, as we had heard yesterday and today, both in the international and domestic jurisdictions, to bring emitters to account for the damage they are causing. Some discussion also point to the utilization of the dispute settlement procedures, which might be among the more prospective of opportunities. Use of advisory opinions might also help to push the argument forward in the international negotiation process. The other point, I believe that there was a recognition that despite our efforts, the threat to statehood is for some countries very real. The notion of statehood in international law is not one that is static. And there may be ways to ensure ongoing characteristics of statehood, even in the absence of a habitable territory. All related rights, including rights over maritime zones and all natural resources, must be retained by the state, the character of which should reflect the will of the people. And I think this includes the government of that state that is being moved to another state. There was a lot of discussion about migration to either internal or external to other states. But I did not hear as much about what to do with the government of that state. Is it still going to function when it moves to another state? How are we going to elect our leaders? Are we going to still maintain our sovereignty with another state? I think those are very, very important questions that we need to, if not articulate, we need to start trying to find some answers for. We know that some displacement is already happening, particularly internal displacement. and most of this is planned in response to slow onset damage. And there are mechanisms to address this, particularly at the international level. But we will need to be part of the long-term international planning for addressing the impacts of climate change. I think significant financial resources will need to be made available for this purpose. I think earlier this morning we discussed about how to finance any relocation. Who is going to finance a relocation? Those questions have not been answered. We need to answer those either through a new treaty or make some amendments to the current conventions that are on the books now. Financial assistance is very important if we are going to talk about relocation. But again, I come back to the main point that I think everybody is in agreement to, that we must contain the level of emission that continues to be emitted now and in the future. The DPR of Germany talked about the UNFCCC. I think one of the reasons that we had discussed about and planned to host this conference is basically because, for me, I thought that the work of the UNFCCC does not address some of these issues. The UNFCCC addresses just the current mitigation, adaptation, levels of commitments to reduce gas emission. But it does not discuss statehood or statelessness, or who's going to pay for immigration and migration, what countries will be asked to take on this responsibility. Those needs to be addressed in a different forum, and this is one of the forums. So I hope I'm able to kind of summarize some of what we have been discussing. So I'll stop here, and we'll encourage more participation from the audience. I thought this was a very important part of the conference, the interaction between the academics and the political side, and just everybody trying to contribute. So I'll get it back to you.
Thank you. So, thoughts on a new international agreement? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. This conference has been a great start, I think, to shifting to climate change.
I'm sorry, could you just identify yourself for everyone here?
Yeah, okay. Fred Muller, I'm a Marshall Island government representative of the people. Right. So I joined Minister Selk also, in this conference. So I'm going to talk as a political source from the island, after Ambassador Muller. But like I was saying, this conference has shifted the climate change debate, and we hope that this momentum will continue. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that information on the Security Council to taking up, this issue. But on the outset, I want to thank Columbia Law School and ambassadors and participants. Over the last few days, we have seen that climate change is truly an encompassing security issue in terms of sovereignty of atoll nations like ours, and also the security of entire populations. As a representative of the people of the Marshall Islands, my focus is very much on the human impact of climate change that encompasses the environmental, legal, economic, cultural, and moral cases to act now on this pressing issue. So first and foremost, our position has to be to try to avert the types of crises that we have heard and to avert our islands sinking, our coral reefs sinking or destroyed, our very being Marshall Islanders being compromised. So our primary focus needs to remain on getting the world's emitters to address their contribution to the problem. We have to maintain our position that anything above 1.5 degree temperature rise is simply unacceptable. However, we still need to put in place measures to protect our resources, culture, and sovereignty, and we need help on that. So I thank you all for the suggestions that have arisen from this conference. There is clearly plenty of time. We all need, we need to do more. There's clearly more, time to do more. In addition to addressing some of the technical aspects, such as plotting of our maritime boundaries, an important step we islanders need to take is to tell our story. Ambassador Mueller made a very important point in the very first session, that for us, land is more than an asset. It is the very fabric of our identity. And I cannot stress just enough how important that is. And I'm sure there are many people in this room that do not understand what I mean when I say that. So we need to tell the story to the world. We no longer can get asked questions such as why we want to save our islands, or what is the economic case for saving the islands, or even why don't we simply move somewhere else. Such questions would not be put across as simple solutions if people understood the fundamental issue of our connection with our land. Please try to understand that concept and help us spread the message. Another thing that remains to be done is to define the legal case or cases. We have had some very detailed and informative presentation on possible legal remedies, and we would hope that the great minds in this room will continue to consider such remedies so that we have to resort to litigation and we are well prepared for it. So again, I thank everyone for their participation and most grateful for the opportunity to learn so much from this conference. I will go home, share this information with my people. We will dialogue more with the national parliament on this issue as well. So simply, it's time to act because time is running out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Mueller. So thoughts on the issue of the need for a international convention or lack thereof? Minister.
Thank you, Professor Gerard. As I said earlier, earlier this afternoon, I look at the concept of a new treaty specifically to address climate change as one that is needed and must be acted on as soon as possible and negotiated. And the concept of naming that treaty, maybe that's where we should start. Naming a treaty that would actually focus attention on what we are attempting to negotiate, if we were to go to negotiation, would clearly define that treaty and make it distinct from other treaties that are already on the books. And I think the right name for that treaty would be a Climate Change Displaced Persons Treaty. Maybe some of you have already thought of that, but I know there are other treaties on the books. There are the Human Rights Treaty and all of those treaties, but those treaties are specifically geared to issues that were never addressed when those treaties were negotiated back then. Some of these treaties are pretty old. And I think if we were to negotiate a new treaty specifically to address climate change, then I would assume that we would have new definitions to define what exactly we mean by displaced persons, climate change displaced persons, so that it doesn't allow people who are just migrating or moving somewhere else because of economic reasons. Clearly defined definitions would go a long way towards alleviating some concern of some of the countries that may end up hosting some of these climate change displaced persons. But someone mentioned that what happens if potential host countries don't want to come to the negotiating table? Well, I think there are other remedies, and some of that was discussed yesterday, legal remedies, to assess liabilities. So there are other ways to get everybody to the negotiating table. Those who are emitters and those who stand to lose their country because of the emission of others. But my thought on this is my thought on the idea, the concept of a treaty, distinctly different from any other treaty to address specifically climate change is one that I hold dearly, and I wish that most of you would share that with me. I think that's very important, especially in the light of bringing attention to an issue that perhaps hasn't been addressed as fully as it should have been in the past. And the idea of bringing the attention of the Security Council to this is we're very supportive of it. And we wish to thank the government of Germany for championing this in the upcoming Security Council debates. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. From Bangladesh.
Yes. Actually, the climate change issue, I understand that it's an equity and justice issue. And it's confirmed by the IPCC that climate change, including sea level rise, global warming, glacier melt, desertification, and other environmental degradations, these are caused due to carbon emissions and exclusively by developed countries. So, and IPCC is composed of hundreds of scientists from all over the world, so there is no reason to disbelieve them. And if it is the case, then I think the thing is very simple. If I cause harm to any person, then I should compensate it. And about the climate change displacement, separate treaty for climate change displacement, one argument always raised that there is the problem of multi-causality. And there is, under 1951 Refugee Convention, it is not exclusively necessary that the person should be exclusively persecuted by government. It's maybe also interrelated with other socio-economic factors. People may decide to move for other reasons as well, including the government persecution. So why we are imposing the criteria of absoluteness as, yes, these people should be exclusively displaced due to the impacts of climate change? I think in case of Maldives and Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Marshall Islands, there is no, it is almost certain that they are displaced due to the impacts of climate change, that is sea level rise. So, and about the international framework, actually my understanding is it is a problem before the international community and huge number of people. And one said there is more than that the traditional refugees, number of traditional refugees. So it is a problem before the international community, and it's so security, there are security aspects as well. So we should address it as it. Whatever be the modus operandi, whatever be the other operational mechanisms, but at least we should address the issue and we should recognize the issue that yes, there is the existence of the problem, and then the other mechanisms can be negotiated in the table. And I was wondering, actually, we have many international conventions on environment. We have conventions for threatened, ecologically threatened species, and we are so reluctant to develop a convention for threatened human settlement or threatened human habitat. I don't know why this kind of skepticism and why should we discuss this issue, that whether it is necessary or not. That's all my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Michelle Klein-Solomon from the International Organization for Migration. And thank you very much, Professor Gerard, and to the two governments on the podium right now. I think this conference has done an extraordinary job of raising awareness of the issues and raising some very fundamental questions. Michael, I thought your summation was excellent. I wanted to take the floor because I think I'm amongst the minority in this room that comes from the migration community. And I heard very strongly what the Minister of the Republic of the Marshall Islands just said a moment ago about the need for a convention, and in particular, not only the physical need, I mean the very compelling circumstances that lead to the need, but also the political point he made about bringing the emitters to the table and holding them responsible. I understand that perspective very deeply, and I think it's a fundamental equity and justice issue. What I wanted to bring was a migration perspective to that. I can't comment on the first part, but I can comment a bit on the migration part. And that's just not to pour cold water on the initiatives, including my colleague sitting right next to me. But I think it's important to understand from the migration context where we are globally on international cooperation. We've talked a lot about the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 67 Protocol and why it's not directly relevant in this context, and if one were to look for creating protections for persons displaced as a result of climate change, why a separate instrument would be needed. Most refugee advocates today, including from the UN High Commission for Refugees, would tell you that if one were to start the negotiations of the Refugee Convention today, you would not have the protections that you have in place. That in 1951, there was a better ability and a consensus in the international community to create that kind of protection for persons moving. The only other major instrument in the migration area specifically focused on that is the 1990 Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. That convention took 10 years to negotiate, from 1980 to 1990. It took another 13 years to have the minimum number of ratifications to enter into force. And now another 10 years later, so we're talking about 30 more years since the negotiation of that convention, there are 46 state parties, not a single one a major destination country for migrants. I say that because I think it's important to remember that it's one thing to make a political statement in this area, but if you want to address a pressing need about the displacement of persons related to environmental degradation exacerbated by climate change, a global instrument in the migration area may not be the most productive way to go about it, for many of the reasons that Jane McAdam raised in her comments. It was not because migration people, advocates, people who are very deeply concerned about persons displaced as a result of these factors don't want to see something. It's just a bit of a reality check about what's possible in the migration area for a whole host of reasons. But let me come back to something that several of you said, because I do think there is a productive avenue to pursue in this area, and that's looking at more regional, situation-specific solutions. I think we all want to create better international cooperation and burden sharing in this area. I profoundly believe that that is most feasible in this, at this time, on a regional basis and a situation-specific basis. So looking at the small island developing states in particular and the particular issues that you face, identifying those partners who would be available and interested and feel a responsibility to help assist may be the more productive way to go than to try to negotiate a global convention about protection of persons as a result of climate change, which is inherently fraught with many, many different problems. Again, this is not coming from a perspective of not wanting to protect people. Far from it. I believe the most constructive way to create internationally binding legal instruments in this area that will protect people is to do so on an issue-specific and a region-specific basis. Thank you very much.
So can I ask you a follow-up question? So, as you indicated, for many years there was a debate about whether there should be a new international agreement on migrant workers. What was the effect of the debate itself? Did the existence and conduct of the debate itself have the effect of increasing general consciousness in the international community about the plight of migrant workers, and do you think it had a net positive effect, or did it divert attention and resources from things that could have had a more concrete impact on migrant workers?
Thank you very much for that follow-up question. I think one of the impacts was to create more polarization along north-south lines and put governments into a protective posture. So the destination countries were very worried about how this proposed treaty would affect their domestic law and litigation risks, as opposed to thinking about what they could do to protect migrant workers and their families. So they went into defensive posture rather than into cooperative posture, and that's precisely what I fear in this case. Thank you.
Additional thoughts on the treaty issue? We've heard very divergent views. Caleb.
Well, law school setting seems to be an appropriate place for hypotheticals, as I recall. And if I could just to continue the discussion, pose a hypothetical, which would be that, I think it's well taken that treaties are not easy things to achieve. We've heard views about focusing on bilateral or regional types of agreements or situation-specific types of agreements. But that's making the assumption that all of the parties concerned would actually be willing to join in to that kind of a regional specific agreement. As a hypothetical, what if they weren't? Then what are we to do? You could, to be entirely speculative, just start to posit or imagine reasons why they wouldn't. And perhaps some of those are that, we're really walking into, I think, a very new place within the international system. And we would be walking into that without the full faith and confidence of the entire international community. It's unknown, hasn't been asked, let alone answered. But it is, I think we're having this kind of either-or type of discussion. Something to keep in mind that on one hand, it is not easy to achieve a wide international treaty. On the other hand, what if it weren't possible to pursue this type of regional mechanism or instrument or arrangement? Thanks.
So do you have an answer to your hypothetical? One of the risks in the law school setting.
Only law professors have answers to their own hypotheticals.
No, actually, that's not good. Ambassador?
I think one of the answer to Caleb's statement, I think, was brought up yesterday by my good friend, the ambassador of Palau. I think we should consider going to the lawsuit avenue. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is and whether we can enforce any judgment but I think any small win would be a big win for us. I don't know, maybe some of the lawyers can comment on that. Is there a real possibility that this is one way of doing it?
Yes, sir.
When you go to a treaty, you must have a consensus about where you're going as to the basic question. And if you go there, there's a big body. I mean, we are all convinced about the effect of climate change, and you don't have to convince us about that. But what about all the others that have enough power politically, I'm not talking about legally, to say, hey, this issue doesn't exist at all. Why should I go in and admit that such an issue exists, and accordingly go into kind of a court, quote unquote, of polluters and pollutees, if I can create these two terms. And all of a sudden you have friction and division, and then you have two camps fighting each other, which is actually what you intend to do by going to court. But instead of amicably deciding in between yourself by conversation, you go to a third party and say, you decide who is right and who is wrong, and accordingly you decide what should be the action. So until you come to a consensus, worldwide consensus, that there is climate change, and all powers that affect it agree to it, you can go and build on it. But if you don't have it, then you'll sit for years. This reminds me that the table in the Vietnam peace talks. It took a year or 2 years just to decide what shape the table will be. You'll have to decide what shape your issue is before you can come and say, okay, now let's determine the parameters of solutions. Thank you.
So, just to follow up, I suppose the other point that was brought up yesterday was we need to develop or to establish the political will to address the issue. Right now, there is not too much political will to go forward, and I think that's one key to trying to address the issue. We need to raise the awareness of all the others. I'll give you an example. When we were at the German mission discussing the Security Council issue, the first question that was raised after the presentation was by a person. He said, why are you going to the Security Council? They're too busy. Don't overburden the Security Council. So apparently he had not been listening to the speakers who were saying this is an issue of urgency. We are dealing with some countries that will cease to exist. So you're right. I think there is still many people that either don't understand or refuse to understand. So I think one of the recommendations that we can take out of this conference is to devise a plan, a strategy to mobilize the public opinion and get the governments and political leaders to really bring this issue up. You know, when the issue of HIV/AIDS came to the Security Council, the whole world was mobilized, and so even though that issue really is not a security issue in the real sense of the word, the Security Council was able to take it up. And so I think we need to mobilize public opinion on that.
Jane?
Thank you. If I could just add to that too, I mean, we saw with discussions around whether there should be any language in the UNFCCC decisions. You know, should there be migration adaptation as a form of adaptation? Should relocation language be in there? Kiribati lobbied very, very strongly for that. But by contrast, Tuvalu and the Federated States of Micronesia didn't want to see that language included at all, because they said, we don't want to be treated like a commodity that can be traded, like carbon credits or something like that. We don't want to be used as pawns in some sort of you know, climate change balancing deal, and they resisted for some time the inclusion of that language. So even getting agreement among affected states can be quite tricky. Another example I think is worth bearing in mind is that in the 1960s, the Australian government offered Nauru, an island off the coast of Australia, to relocate that population as a result of phosphate mining and the destruction of Nauru, and they said, we're not ceding this territory to Nauru, however you can have your own local administrative council, maintain your traditions and cultures, and basically function here fairly autonomously. And Nauru rejected that offer and said, no, we would effectively be assimilated into Australian culture, and we don't want that. So there you've got an example, and I mean there are a lot of political issues going on in the background there. But, I mean, there was a situation where there was a piece of land being handed over in some form with capacity for some self-governance and people being relocated altogether, and that was nonetheless rejected. So I think we do need to think quite carefully here about what strategies will appeal, what won't, and that we may not actually get a united front as well.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Mackenzie. I'm a journalist, and I've been following with somewhat of inexpertise the situation of migrants moving from sub-Saharan Africa into places such as Libya and then crossing into Europe. And lately, and this is a question for Ambassador Berger or perhaps Michelle VIOM, if this gives you any insight within the internal politics of Europe on how we might deal with this issue. Because as I understand it, there was talk of pulling back the Schengen Accords between the states. Italy and France are fighting over who's going to keep these immigrants. And if we can see a growing narrative with that very small issue.
Yes, I'm not an expert on migration issues, but you're right. There was a very intense discussion on, especially in Italy, because there was a very strong concern that due to the crisis in Libya, there might be a serious flow of migrants from Italy and Malta to other countries and other parts of Europe. And for the time being, it was not possible to reach an agreement among EU member states on how the new migrants, refugees, could be distributed among European countries. And we have done that in the past. For example, during the wars in the Balkans, Germany had more than 1.5 million refugees from these countries who stayed there for many, many years. And now here on the occasion of the crisis in Libya, we have seen that I imagine also due to the economic situation in many, many countries, it's very difficult to accommodate these migrants. And this is a discussion that is still ongoing. And you're right, it stressed a little bit our Schengen Agreement. Schengen, for those who are not familiar with it, means that you can travel within these countries of the European Union who agreed to the Schengen Agreement freely. It means if you have a visa, if you have a paper, you can travel freely from Italy to Spain, to Germany, to Portugal without additional controls. So it's a challenge we are facing, and we hope that we can deal with it.
Bert?
It seems to me that the European example is informative, really only in as far as we look back a couple of years ago when there were North African and African migrants clinging to tuna nets, having been basically locked out of Europe, waiting to be picked up by boats and in desperate need of protection. And, you know, hearing the discussions around whether to have a convention, whether not to have a convention, I accept, of course, the arguments. It takes considerable time. Equally, I do understand that states have particular interests with respect to the way in which the Migrant Workers Convention was negotiated and its effect. But equally, it seems to me that there's a central issue here with respect to the degree to which the states of concern here have power to raise their voices, to point out this is what's happening to them. They are endangered. They are the ones that need solutions. And in such a context, perhaps some of these options, whether it's looking to advance a convention, or whether it's looking towards other instruments in the UN system, maybe that is simply an instrumental way of reclaiming some power and using that as a basis of advancing negotiations.
Tom.
Yeah. And again, in light of the impassioned interventions by our friends from some of the island states here in the room, I just want to thank you for your forbearance and patience and generosity with us. I speak now as a U.S. citizen. Kevin Conrad famously said at Bangkok to the delegation for the United States, we ask for your leadership, we expect and hope for your leadership, but if you can't lead, please get out of the way. That was in 2007, and 4 years later, I think the United States has done neither. And this, I think, then when we ask ourselves, what can we do? I think that here in the United States, first, every time we find ourselves confronted with a position that wants to split the difference around climate, we remember what we've heard today and say to those people, whether it's as professors from Colombia or people who work in philanthropy like myself say, do you realize that your negotiating position is predicated on the disappearance of a people? And here's some names, and here's some email addresses so that you can talk to them. Because that's what we confront. And this is no longer politics. This is, very, very, very clear. And I think that we are falling down in terms of our, the moral imperatives, I guess, of what we're seeing, number one. Number two, as a political matter here in the United States, I think we have been the singular, arguably the most important force in terms of tamping down the ambition, ignoring the fairness problems, and watering down the bindingness of the UNFCCC process, which is the process that we have to hand within which many of these issues can be addressed. And that, to me, is the single most important challenge that we may face as citizens of the United States, is that we are taking what exists today and emptying it of the kind of content that might be useful to our colleagues from the small island states. And that's our challenge. That's what we have to turn around. Obviously, we need a different kind of politics, and this will be my final comment. Fortunately, we have in our midst, or unfortunately, many climate-displaced persons already. Talk to the cab drivers here in New York City from Bangladesh and ask them why they're here. And many of them will start to tell you stories about climate change and about access to water and what happens when a crop cycle fails once and what happens when it fails the second time, and then what sorts of decisions families have to make. These voices, talk to people in Kentucky. Mountaintop removal is a kind of environmental disaster that creates displaced peoples. The people in our midst understand these things. The problem is that we haven't either sought out or articulated or stood beside these people and made sure that they could wend their way into a kind of politics that would no longer allow the United States to be the laggard that it is today on climate policy, and potentially start to move it towards that leadership that it has to take up.
Let me ask some of the other U.S. citizens who are here. There are quite a few of us. The view on how the U.S. government would likely react, Congress would likely react to the Senate might react to the prospect of ratification of this kind of an agreement. And let's assume not today's Senate. Let's assume a Senate a few years from now. I didn't mean for that to be entirely rhetorical.
Just a side comment. We have in the United States still a refugee problem, not a refugee, illegal immigrants that we cannot solve, which affects our economy drastically, one way or another, whichever way you do or you go. Either you take the 12 million and put them on boats or on trucks and send them either to Mexico or to other places. You have a problem. To deal with extra problem of new immigrants is a difficult political situation today at the setup of the political situation in U.S. And I don't know how it will be improved or not into 2012. So most probably the kingpin of all solution still comes to the United States. They themselves are involved in such problems that I don't know how much they can deal with the 60,000 people or some of the Marshall Islands. With all due respect.
Ambassador, Minister.
Thank you. This discussion reminds me, I'm trying to think of words, reminds me of a story, and it's not a story, it's actually factual. I was involved in the cleanup of Enewetak Atoll, one of the atolls that were used in the nuclear testing. And at the end of the cleanup, the council, the local government council of Enewetak, the people, and I was doing the translation work for the American lawyer who was helping them out. The Department of Energy came down and asked them, because they had dumped all the nuclear waste on one of the islands, one of the shells, one of the nuclear affected atolls, in one of the biggest craters on one of the small islands in the atoll, and capped it with a cement. And they call it the cactus tomb, because cactus refers to the test that exploded the bomb and created the crater. And so when they were asked, what do you want to put up as warning signs? What kind of words would you like to put up as warning signs to prevent people and warn people not to come to this specific island? The answer was, don't ask us. You dumped it there. You ask yourself, and you put the words in there. Now, that was then, and now we're talking about the land list, or let me put it in proper perspective, the loss of a country, the loss of a culture, the loss of a people, the loss of their culture and identity. So we would, I guess we would ask the world, the images, if they were to ask us, what do you want to do? You're losing your country. I said, well, you know, you tell us when to swim, but don't tell us how to swim. We will figure that out ourselves. I think that's the word that we should be telling the rest of the world. That just let us know when you want us to swim, but don't tell us how to swim, because we will figure that out ourselves. Because that's what, it seems to me, that's what the world is telling us. That the time will come for you to swim, but where do you swim to? Which island would you swim to? That's up to you. We won't tell you, because we're not willing to allow you to swim to our shores. I think that's all I can say about it. Thank you.
The footnote I would add to that, Minister, is that with respect to the sign on Eniwetok, when I was in the Marshall Islands in December, I was taken to the Eniwetok Dome and I walked on top of it, which is why I have such a nice glow about me. But there is no sign. Bottom line is there is no sign there. Did you have a, yes?
I just wanted to comment as an American, because there was this sort of deafening silence in response to your question, and I think there's a reason for that. I think we are at a law conference, and we recognize on some level that there are very few legal and political processes that are allowing us to think through this in a way that is, well, at least legal. And coming from the perspective of climate justice, environmental justice, all, I think, sort of second and third generation manifestations of a kind of civil rights movement. I think we're stuck in some ways, because if we take this seriously, and if we are taking as a starting point what we know from the science of yesterday, which is that some of this is inevitable, if we take this seriously as Americans, then we can wring our hands and talk at conferences, but we also have to recognize that we have to be thinking, I think, extra legally in some way. Now, I'm a law professor. I believe in the rule of law, and I want to have faith in our processes. I don't see that happening. I think we know realistically at the Supreme Court this summer that there's going to be real traction. legislatively, I think we're stuck. I think the executive is also stuck. This is why there is that inability to really express what the options should be for Americans, because there is a disempowerment here that's familiar. And I'm just thinking about what it must have felt like the day before the Civil Rights Act was passed. And I think we need to remember that.
There is a real-world example of the reception of the Marshallese in the U.S. In Arkansas. And Delora Hughes, I hate to put you on the spot, but I will anyway. You've presented a fascinating poster on that subject. Can you tell the people who don't know about it a little bit about what the situation is in Arkansas?
It took you longer to get to me than I thought it would. Yeah, my name is Delora Hughes, and I'm a very silent law professor, too. And I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which neighbors the city of Springdale, which has a very large Marshallese community. Some would say the largest Marshallese community outside of the RMI. And I guess what I've been sitting here figuring that you would call my name at some point, trying to think of what to say, is that the response in, I think no matter what you do, whether it's an international piece or a federal piece in the U.S., most of what I'm writing about and thinking about is how to help the folks that are already here, and how to address the legal concerns. And when I listen to the minister talk, what I think about is how to help the folks that are still dealing with the health and socioeconomic impact of the testing, of the nuclear testing from so long ago, who are worried about those issues to some degree far more than they are about issues of climate change. And the reason that I came to this conference was to learn, of course, but to also see if there are lessons from the communities that are in the U.S., in Washington and in Hawaii, and of course in Arkansas, that would have impact on what the migration folks in particular are thinking about and doing, and how those of us who are living in these communities can assist in a longer term plan. I would say that on the ground, what's happening now is our government within the state of Arkansas and particularly within the city of Springdale is kind of at a loss for how to address and work with the population that we already have. And I think that unfortunately, to some degree, your comment is probably correct, that there's not going to be a fabulous response to the idea of an influx of more folks. What I would say back to them, though, what I would be, to some degree, I think we would be remiss if we didn't echo what the minister said, which is this is a problem we created in more than one way, not just as emitters for climate change and erosion and all these other issues, but we've had tremendous impact on this population and have been, in essence, using their land for many years. And I think I'll speak as a U.S. citizen, that is, we're way past what we're going to do, and we're way into what we should do and what we have to do. And so I guess from my perspective, I hope to help start that education process within Arkansas, and my hope is that spreads.
Just for the people who don't know, can we back up a minute, and can you just very quickly say a word about the community in Arkansas and why they're there and what they're doing?
The community in Arkansas is, like I said, primarily situated in Springdale. This is northwest Arkansas. Pretty much the border is northwest as you can get, bordered almost with Oklahoma and Missouri. The majority of the population is there because the cost of living is extremely low, and there are lots and lots of unskilled labor work within the chicken processing plants of Tyson. And the primary reason for that, there's a couple of people that I've spoken with have asked, well, we have chicken processing plants where I live. Tyson has been very open to employing folks where the language skills in English are not particularly high. and there are lots and lots of jobs. And now that, to some degree, that population is actually spreading now that Tyson is opening up processing plants in different parts of Arkansas. So the Marshallese are spreading a little bit more throughout the state. But concentrated in that area, I believe the Springdale, the Springdale area, the Marshall Islanders represent approximately 5% of the population. If you look to the census numbers are currently in question as to how many people actually reported as specifically as Marshallese versus Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. So a lot of people look to the school district registration numbers, and Marshallese represent 12% of the registered students in the Springdale School District, which is a very significant population.
And the Republic of the Marshall Islands has a consulate there.
We do. They do. And some very active community folks in the Springdale area. And the most recent activity, which is on the poster if you want to read about it, but the GAO committee visited the area in March to talk about issues of funding under the compact, and because of the large number of Marshall Islanders in the Springdale area.
Robin?
So I want to respond to the comment that you made. Sorry, I don't remember your name, about what we as U.S. citizens can do. And I know we're at a legal conference, but really, I mean, in my experience of doing work in the world, we are, as individuals and in the communities in which we live in the United States, the largest emitters of carbon dioxide emissions. And so there are things that we can do that's not about the convention, but really looking at what we individually are doing to contribute to the emissions. And I've had the opportunity to be part of a national conversation about the National Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment that our government is currently in the process of doing. And there are things that are happening in New York that are amazing. And I would encourage you, if you live in New York, to get involved in them. King County in Seattle is doing incredible work, but those parts of the United States and in Alaska, I would have to say, we are doing remarkable things to deal with climate change. And so get involved in your communities, not as lawyers or legal scholars, but as people living within your communities, to really look at how we can be sustainable, stop emitting the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving our planet to an edge, and yeah, be involved citizens in your community.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Well, I'm Carolina Claro with the University of São Paulo, and I just came back from a conference in Ecuador with an international network for migration studies, migration and development. And you know what? There were like 150 people there, and they didn't really want to talk about environment-induced migration, because they thought the thought of it would make them think the immigrants would face more prejudice than immigrants are facing right now in the host countries. So it's truly a complicated issue, but I don't think you should give up in any way in an international agreement. But I personally don't see it coming the next decade or so, because as we've seen from the Maldives in the last couple of years, they have tried to impose some international discussions about migration and environment, and no one has paid much attention to that. But you already have some international legal instruments that could be applicable right now, and especially through cooperation agreements, bilateral agreements, and also regional agreements. So I think you should really focus on that and don't lose hope, because international law is over here, and you need to find solutions right now. And well, I'm not a pessimist, but I don't think many countries would accept, in this kind of migratory crisis we're dealing with, would accept many immigrants. But I don't think you should lose hope at all on that. Thank you.
Great.
I'm actually going to build off of that last comment and redirect the conversation, if that's okay, back to this question about new international protections, or really existing international protections. And specifically, one question I had was inspired by a comment by Les Stein, sorry to put you on the spot, where he was asked about how he felt about international or human rights protections. And his response was that they were maybe less useful, and that the focus should be less on the protections that we have or could have, and more on the sort of practical planning process. And I guess my question would be to the people that were discussing human rights protections, and including those discussing possible future protections under a new convention, what would be your response to that feeling, which I think is also partially reflected in Jane McAdams' suspicion of a new convention process?
So the question of, so advocates of a human rights-oriented approach, an argument has been raised that it's so much paper and that it doesn't have a large practical effect. Jane?
I wouldn't characterise it that way, actually. I don't think a human rights approach means you need a new treaty. I think a human rights approach, as I was suggesting, where I'm coming from is the perspective of how do we best provide for what people, affected communities themselves, say they want. And for me, that's not going down the track of a new displacement instrument. So I just wanted to pick up on that. I don't think that a human rights approach is the same thing as a displacement treaty necessarily.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to add that from a human rights perspective, I agree with both sides of the argument, but I think the advantage that a human rights lens can bring to this issue goes back to what Professor Oposo talked to us about yesterday, where lawyers tell a story, and every story needs a face. If because of climate change, I've lost my right to life, my right to food, my right to access to water and sanitation, I've lost my identity. If human rights can put that lens on this issue, that contribution alone is worth exploring.
Michelle?
That was extremely profound, and let me follow, and not nearly as profoundly, but in response to Greg's question, that I think we do need to document precisely what you've just said, and to show in individual cases, in individual countries, in individual communities, precisely the violations of rights that are taking place, the lack of enforcement of those recognized international human rights, to show what that means in the context of the small island states, as well as countries like Bangladesh. I mentioned very briefly in my presentation that we had done a study globally called Assessing the Evidence, but then took that to the national level in Bangladesh and looked at what it meant in the context of Bangladesh to have displacement as a result of environmental factors, and broke that down into particular drivers and particular types of displacement, and then looked at what kinds of solutions might be warranted. And together with the government of Bangladesh, held a national level consultation that brought in the various different ministries, the various different stakeholders from the environmental community, from the labor community, from the rights community, from the migration community, to then look at the particular drivers, the particular circumstances, and therefore what kinds of responses could usefully be generated in that context. That's now been documented. There's a publication which has now been circulated globally. That's now used as an advocacy tool and an awareness-raising tool, but focused on practical solutions for those problems. And I would suggest that that's perhaps what could usefully be done here as well. I hear the frustration in the voice of the Minister of the Republic, the Marshall Islands. I hear that you are past that at this point, that it's no longer a question of documentation, it's no longer a question of awareness raising, it's a question of rectifying and getting remedy for violations of occurred. I think we still have a way to go, and I would encourage you to do more on this in this regard, and to seek as much as possible the support of all of us in your efforts. Thank you.
A question for Ambassador Mueller and Minister Silk. It's hard to imagine a more visible face of human rights violation than what happened at Bikini and Eniwetok and Rongelap. And yet the Marshallese have not gotten legal or legislative satisfaction for those human rights violations, which are very visible human rights violations. Climate change is a somewhat more visceral issue, at least it is until it's too late almost. What can be done differently to actually see effective results that have not been seen or satisfied in regards to the nuclear issues?
I'll let my boss answer first.
Well, what could be done differently with regards to climate issue, climate change?
Nuclear.
Nuclear? Well, you know, I know we're not here to discuss Bikini and Eniwetok and the issues surrounding the nuclear testing. But we have been approaching the United States government, and we will continue to approach the United States government as we have been doing for the last 50-odd years. We have gotten some agreement in place that compensate our people, no, not fully, but somewhat compensate our people for the loss of their land and property, and for medical problem associated with nuclear testing. But that's an issue that we are still discussing with the government on additional compensation that we hope we will get. Maybe not now, but sometime in the future. But that's I really don't want to have to discuss that at this forum because that's a different issue. But coming to the issue that is of concern to us here is the issue of climate change and global warming and sea level rise. And I think the issue is one that could be addressed if enough concerned citizens of the world, including citizens of the United States and other emitters, were to take up the cost and side with us on this issue. It's not just us, the Marshall Islands, because this is a bigger issue than the Marshall Islands. It's an issue that encompasses Manhattan as well, lower Manhattan. But I believe that really the political will and the leadership of NGOs also would play a role in this, private citizens as well, and focus the attention of the United States citizens and leaders in the country, but also canvass support from other parts of the world to focus attention on this issue. That's why we have been saying that, one, we need to bring this matter to the attention of the Security Council. We need to look at options, including a treaty on climate change and climate change affecting people, and push forward the negotiations on the UNFCCC, although those have been stalled for some time. But I think we have to put a human face to this. And it reminds me of I read a National Geographic magazine not too long ago where the focus was on this bear in Alaska losing his appetite because of global warming, and the concern there by the authors of that newspaper, the article, of what's going to happen to the bear if the climate change continue and they lose their appetite, they lose the ice flows and they lose these seals and appetites there. And so I think that was good because it concerns an important part of the species of the world, animal species. But I think another article should be in not only the National Geographic but other publications and journals about losing the human species. The human species losing their appetite somewhere, whether it be Marshall Islands, Maldives, or other parts of the world, or Lower Manhattan. The danger is real. That's the thing that we really have to realize, that the danger is real. The science is telling us. And even the science are saying it's too late to reverse maybe 1 or more meters of sea level rise. So adaptation and mediation are part of it, but I think the attention should be on the human phase of what's going to happen. And that human phase could be placed right next to the bear. And both would be competing for the same attention. Perhaps maybe we will give a little more attention to the human face than to the bear. At least the bears could always survive because they could take them from one zoo to the next. As you go, as the water rises up, you could take them from one zoo to the next. Whereas the human face, where do you take that face if the land is not there? Thank you.
If I may just add a few comments. I'm so glad you raised that issue on nuclear matters, because it has given me some idea as to how we address this climate change. Let me just share it with you. Last year, at the United Nations, we were able to get an amendment passed by consensus to amend the NPT, the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, asking the Secretary General to establish, to come up with a report, basically, that would review the state of what's happening to the nuclear contaminants in the Marshall Islands. And at the moment, I think he's working on trying to set up a committee that would involve the IAEA and the atomic, the UNSCAR, and of course we're now in discussion with the U.S. government to try to come up with a plan as to how we can address the remaining issues on the nuclear matter. So it has given me an idea. Perhaps we should take that same route where we would try to go to the General Assembly with some kind of an amendment to certain treaties or conventions, asking for some resolution to the issue of climate change and displacement. Because I know when we did the efforts for the NPT, there was initially a lot of resistance, especially from the United States and from Russia and others. But through consultation and outreach and just dialoguing, at the end of the day, we were able to get an amendment that was adopted by consensus. So I think maybe there's another way of doing this rather than doing a new convention. Perhaps we should go this route of trying to introduce some amendments through the General Assembly, asking for some resolution either through the Secretary General or through the establishment of some commission or committee that could bring some solution to this issue. Thank you.
So it's been a very long day. We started at 9 o'clock this morning. We've had a lot of very illuminating and intense discussions, and at 6 o'clock we have the reception in Low Library and the keynote dinner at 7 p.m. There will be people who will give directions to those of you who don't know exactly how to get there. We will resume here tomorrow morning at 9:15 for the concluding day, and much of that day will be devoted to adaptation measures. What is it that can be done with the Marshall Islands and more generally to help the threatened island nations cope with the sea level rise that is coming? So thank you all today for your attendance and your vigorous participation. We'll see you tonight at the reception and tomorrow morning at the program. Thank you.